fun. The history people can look up is this caused the Ukrainian diaspora to get their veritable diaspora panties in a twist because they thought it was an attack on them by the Reagan administration. Because the Reagan administration was feeling pressure to do something about the Demyanjuk case. And so what did the Ukrainian diaspora do? Of course, they turned to the Democrats. You follow me?
That's right.
Joe Biden, with his long career up on the Hill, was one of the people who was instrumental. So Biden's connections to Ukraine, and this is a topic for another time, but I just want to put enough of it so people can start to look this stuff up. And again, at our age, John, in our 50s, we remember the Demyanjuk thing. I remember it. It was something, it was on the news all the time.
Yes.
So anyway, we'll talk about it more at some other point, but I'm just telling you, if someone wants to start following this thread, John, there's a lot here.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is a deep story, and it's fascinating.
It is. And you know what? No one's looked into it. I know it. But that's it, basically.
Yeah.
Shane sometimes. My son Shane sometimes. Because he was stuck, in cars with me constantly. And I'm blathering on about this at all times. But as I was talking to our boss today, I'll use the word semi-obsession with Ukraine. I made it my business to learn about the Ukraine stuff because I saw it at the center of Russiagate. Boy, yes. John, that's kind of paid off with the current situation, right?
Yes.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. It's not complicated. Like and like I've said before, I really didn't know anything about Ukraine until I started listening to you.
And I didn't know anything about Ukraine, period, until I noticed Ukrainians were showing up everywhere when I was investigating Russiagate. And I was baffled by it. I didn't understand it. So I made it my business to start to celebrate Stefan Bandera in Ukraine. So the hypocrisy of Biden, you oppose Nazis here.
Right.
But Nazis in Ukraine.
That's okay.
Right. You see what I'm saying? It's very hypocritical.
Outrageous.
In fact, I'll say one other thing, then I'll get to Tarif. It's just interesting, and I'll just throw it out. It was interesting. Someone sent me an interview that noted former Klansman David Duke had done with somebody, where they were talking about the Russian-Ukraine issue. And it was really interesting for this reason. David Duke is a guy who clearly knows American white nationalists, right?
Yeah, definitely.
He literally doesn't know about them. He knows them.
Yes.
Right?
That's right.
And you know what he said? Think about this. And I believe it because he knows people. He said a lot of young white nationalists want to go to Ukraine to fight Russia.
Wow.
Think about that. Because you and I would have no way of knowing that because we don't know any white nationalists.
No,
right?
I don't. I don't know a single one.
No, that's right. But he knows a lot. And you know what Duke's take is very interesting. He's saying you shouldn't go. He's like, he said, I get it. I didn't like the communists either. I didn't like Russia under the USSR. But this isn't that. No. And you're being fooled. And then there's a lot of nonsense about the Jews. But isn't it interesting that it was an interesting insight into the world of white nationalists from someone who knows it, that a lot of them want to go over. I'll tell you what it reminded me of, John. ISIS. It reminded me of people, right?
You know, it's funny that you bring up ISIS because today I got an automated email from the Federal Bureau of Prisons email service saying that a prisoner wanted to add me to his email list so he could communicate with me. And his name was Ahmed Hassan al-Tunisi. I have never heard this name before, so I Googled him. And it turned out that he's from St. Louis. And in 2013, he started communicating with ISIS and wanted to join ISIS. And then in 2017, he was arrested at Chicago O'Hare Airport trying to get to Turkey so he could cross the border and join ISIS. So I clicked deny, and then I deleted the email. I don't want to be in touch with somebody like that.
Well, and that's why it was interesting to me. It just seems like in the same way that ISIS did bring in fighters from around the world into places like Syria, for instance, right? That in a similar way, white nationalist fighters are flocking to Ukraine right now. Think about that. Because I'm not hearing anybody in the media at all talk about that. Right?
Yep.
And what should happen is someone should take that lead that I'm saying now. Maybe someone means me on my free, on my vacation. But just because David Duke says it doesn't mean you go, okay, well, I believe it. Right. But it sounds plausible to me, right? It sounds like something that would happen, and it needs to be run down, and it's fascinating. 202-521-1320. Tarif, thanks so much for holding on so long. What is on your mind?
I have two comments, but I don't think I can get to my second one. But first, I'd like to say free drilling science and also Fauci NIH funding experiments on foster children in New York State. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Cecilia Faber reports. My comment is this. Ethiopia is more about geopolitics than most the Tigray region is because they think China and Russia was talking to the Egyptians to keep them out of it, putting pressure on them. And also satellite imagery, what Alice McCurry said that China is selling missile technology to sharing missile technology with, so that's a pushback against the U.S. and British policy. My second comment is dealing with, Ted Cruz. He's not running for president. I feel to believe he's running for vice president because Trump seems like he's going to have that nomination. Ted Cruz, to me, is a slicker version of Mike Pompeo and a Steve Bannon. So if he run and Mitch McConnell put him as vice president, only person I think can push him away is what is his name, Santos out of Florida. So Santos going to have to run for president too, and hopefully he get picked by the same people that's in the Republican Party, like Rand Paul, and hopefully he can push Ted Cruz out the way and he can become vice president. It seems like that's the play and that's what's going on. I'm just putting my 2 cents in for that. That's all.
Well, I'll just say this, and I want John to comment on this too. Ted Cruz is not running for vice president. He is running to take Donald Trump out, period.
Absolutely right.
Right, John?
Absolutely right. Yes, 100% agree. He is not running for vice president. Definitely not. Now, DeSantis may be running for vice president. I think he wants to be president, but if Trump runs again, I think DeSantis would gladly be Trump's vice president because then it would be a natural transition for him to run virtually unopposed for president the next time. But yeah, well, Ted Cruz wants to be president.
I'll tell you who could be who's not running for vice president is Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo, has made it clear he's interested in being president. However, you notice he's not attacked Trump, right?
Yeah, that's right.
He's flirted around the edges because they don't agree on policy and a lot of stuff. But Pompeo has not brought the knives out. Cruz has. Cruz has thrown down I'm mixing my vaguely Shakespearean metaphors here, John. But Cruz has thrown down the gauntlet, right?
Yes, he has.
He said, Trump, I'm coming for you. Pompeo.
Yeah, even though he said it to a a quote-unquote journalist, a kid, he did that on purpose. That was the trial balloon. He wanted to see what the Republican rank and file were going to say in response to Ted Cruz saying publicly for the very first time in this cycle that he wants to be president.
Yeah, so that's my take. Drew, 521-1320. Karen, what is on your mind? And then we'll go to Malik after this.
You can hear me, right?
Yep.
You can hear me?
Go ahead, Karen. Yes, go ahead, Karen.
A cup of coffee. Okay. I'm going to make one comment first, and then I'm going to ask you about Federal Reserve notes, the currency Federal Reserve notes. I have a funny comment to make about children of unmarried parents. If somebody has the goal to call them a bastard, their response should be that they're more uncomfortable with it than I am, if you understand what I'm saying. Anyway, let me get on with the question about Federal Reserve notes. You know what I'm talking about when I say Federal Reserve notes, yes, the currency?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Here's my question for you. There was a time, I guess back in the 1960s or so, when we used to be on the gold and silver standard, so gold first and then the silver standard. And the silver standard was the last thing that we were on before the U.S. notes converted to Federal Reserve notes. In your opinion, would we have a cashless society to the extent that we do, debit and credit cards and Bitcoin and whatever else it is that we have? Would everybody be accepting of a cashless society if it were not for the Federal Reserve notes? In other words, do you think that we would still have a cashless society if we were on the U.S. note and if we were on the gold or silver standard?
You want to take that, Lee?
Yeah, I will. So because it's literally impossible to answer, in my opinion. It starts to get into the realm of what sci-fi nerds call speculative fiction. Mm-hmm. In other words, I could posit a similar question and say, well, how would currency be different if it had never featured pictures of the president? And I could follow that thread and come up with interesting conjecture, but that's all it is. I don't know. I will say this. The concept, and I've mentioned this before, and people should look it up. It was really interesting. One of my favorite radio shows is This American Life. They had a thing about money. Kind of weird. Does that make sense? Like just about it's one of those things where it's weird, but most people never ponder it because we just take human consciousness for granted. We know we're conscious. And we don't think about it. And so it is with money. The concept of money and the way it works is actually, if you stop and think about it, weird. And they talked about how, here's the thing. I like credit cards. I like cashless transactions. You know what I'm saying, John? So, for instance.
I do too. I do too. And, to tell you the truth, this is just an aside, but we're several years behind the Europeans. I mean, many of those countries, I was just there last, month. Many of those countries have a truly cashless economy, a cashless society. Sweden said at the beginning of 2021 that in 5 years they wanted to be completely cashless, where there was just simply no such thing as cash money. So we're already several years behind where the Europeans are.
My finances were a mess going into the divorce and coming out of Sioux Falls. And so for a while, I had no bank account. Literally, I had no bank account. And so they had to pay me old school. Yulia in the office there would mail me checks every couple of weeks. I got to tell you, it sucked so much.
Yeah. I'm with you.
I'll remind you of something that has never happened, because we get to, like most people, we get direct deposit, right?
Yes.
I'll tell you what happened twice. Twice this happened to me, John. I opened the envelope to get my check, and I ripped the check in half.
Yeah, I've done that. I hate that.
And then I had no money for a few days while she had to resend me via FedEx a check. That was all because I was not living cashless. Does that make sense? I was going with checks and, thank goodness she wasn't sending giant stacks of bills, let's say. That would have really sucked. So the whole concept of money, a lot of people like to, it's so weird. People like to get weird about it. But imagine doing online purchasing if there was no such thing, even as PayPal or the ability to use your credit card or whatever.
Right.
You wanted to buy something you saw online, and then you got to send them a check, and because they got to wait for it, it'd be crazy. So, whatever. On the other hand, I also like having some cash. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Outside the studio, we have quite a large homeless population, and there are a handful of homeless guys who sell these newspapers, Street Sense. It's kind of the homeless newspaper. They write stories, they write poems, they take pictures, and they make their own newspaper. And it's $2, and you can give them whatever you want over $2 as a donation. And I always do. I always buy it from them because they're trying to make an honest living. But it's more and more frequent that I just simply don't have cash. I just don't carry cash because I don't need any cash. I have a debit card. I pay everything with my debit card. If I don't have the money in my account to buy something, I just simply don't buy it. And so I feel bad because these guys, recognize me now, and they come up to me, Street Sense. I literally don't have any money on me at all. And I think that's the future, really.
Yeah, and it could be. And I would be not shocked at all if they just start taking, they have a little machine, they can take your credit card or whatever. Or you just aim your phone at them.
It's coming.
202-521-1320. Yes. Malik, what is on your mind? Sorry you had to sit through some of that conjecture about the sci-fi aspects of money. But go ahead.
No, I think that's interesting stuff, and I think we're all thinking about that right about now. At least a lot of us are. But I kind of came in as, and I'm sorry that I missed a good portion of the show, but I came in as you were discussing nationalists, American nationalists going to the Ukraine, and I had an interesting experience. Roughly about 2.5 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, on Facebook, and I'm not intentionally antagonistic to Nazis and white nationalists online, but when I do get into it with them, I don't mind, to be quite honest. And I don't, to be quite honest with you, I don't mind getting dirty with them, and because they're kind of used to dealing with folks who are afraid of them. But I had an incident on Facebook where they kind of found a post that I made, and I don't even remember what the post was about, but had one guy found me, and I went to his page, and all of his photos on his page showed that, that he is probably former military, pretty well trained, and he was one of those weekend warrior types, and you could see from his photos, he trained all over the U.S. And then I had other Nazis, who were kind of making their way. And I say Nazis because they were, as they found my post and started harassing me and making black jokes and so forth, they were speaking in German, a broken German. And they were cracking jokes that I had to translate. They were cracking black jokes in German, which was, I found it entertaining. People kept saying to me, why don't you block them? Why don't you block them? I was like, man, I'm enjoying this. But when I went to their pages, a lot of their photos were these guys and girls who would travel to the Ukraine to train.
Yes. Yep.
It's very interesting.
No, it is interesting. And like I say, in a sense, it's one of the reasons I do wish sometimes, and I get all the reasons not to do it, which is why we don't do it. But sometimes on some stories, people like a David Duke or a Louis Farrakhan, I could name other people, have a perspective on it because they already know that they're very unpopular with large segments. Therefore, in a weird way, they're more honest. Like David Duke was saying a lot of really offensive stuff about Jews, as not surprising. On the other hand, his analysis of Ukraine, Russia, was better than any analysis on the subject that I heard from the mainstream media. And it's weird. And I've had the same thing with Farrakhan and people from Nation of Islam, who I knew and became very friendly with. Some people who were with Nation of Islam, who I'd met when I was covering the George Zimmerman trial down in Florida. And it was interesting. You get that perspective on things. Or not Malik, but Malik Zulu Shabazz from the New Black Panther Party. I've met people who were with the New Black Panther Party. And again, it's an interesting, different perspective. And in a lot of ways, they're fringy, but it makes them weirdly more honest because they're not worried about, gee, will I offend anyone if I say this? They're already living outside the mainstream. So, again, it's one of those interesting things. But I'm not at all shocked, Malik. There's noticeable connections between American white nationalists and Ukraine, and very few people talk about it, but it is obvious. And you saw it for yourself. When we come back, great friend of the show, Carter Laren will be joining us from the Unsafe Space podcast. That's coming up right after this short break on The Backstory.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
When the going gets tough, the powerful want propaganda. But we won't let them cancel the facts. Whether you're woke or drowsy, we know that you can handle the truth, and we're giving it to you every morning. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan every Monday through Friday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Your first stop for sanity in a world gone mad.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change.
Scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show.
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
And we are back. Final half hour of the show today. Don't forget, we are off Friday. I'm talking to you, John, so you don't call in and sit there for hours.
Yeah.
The phone ring,
Just
whatever's going on. You know
to call me.
Now, I'm going to ask you to sort of riff off what I was riffing off at the end there. But let's bring on Carter now and bring him into the discussion. Carter Laren from the Unsafe Space podcast is joining us. Hey, Carter, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Merry Christmas to both of you.
Thank you, sir. Merry Christmas.
And a Happy New Year. Because,
yes.
the Christmas party is kind of over. So
I'm still on break, so I'm still celebrating.
Well, yeah, you did. Very Russian of you. Now, John, I was talking about the broad idea that sometimes with people who have reprehensible views, you get interesting stuff. And it occurred to me over the break, John, that you might have a unique perspective because you, as head of counterterrorism at the CIA after 9/11, you knew people, you met people, you talked to people. I'm not saying you were pals with them.
Sure.
You were, in many cases, arresting them. But what did you find in talking to Al-Qaeda people, let's say?
Yeah.
Anything interesting along the lines of what I was talking about? And then, Carter, feel free to jump in if you have anything to say. Go ahead.
I'm so glad that you brought this up. It wouldn't have occurred to me to make the connection. Yeah, one of the things that I learned early on while we were capturing these Al-Qaeda fighters, these are people who had been fighting at Tora Bora. They crossed the border into Pakistan and had taken up in Al-Qaeda safe houses. One of the things that I learned was that very, very few of them had any real beef with the United States. They couldn't find the U.S. on a map. They had no particular political problem with the United States, but they all had essentially the same backstory. And the backstory was that they were all from some isolated village in whatever country they came from. Lots of Algerians, Tunisians, Saudis, Yemenis, Libyans. They were almost universally illiterate, couldn't read and write, had no idea what was in the Quran. They had never read the Quran because they couldn't read. And they couldn't get married because no man wanted his daughter to marry some loser who couldn't read and write and didn't have any job skills. And so the local imam went to them and said, what are you doing in this village? You should go to Afghanistan and make jihad against the Americans, because if you do, we'll pay you $500 a month. And if you're martyred, we'll give a $500 martyrdom bonus to your parents. Well, they had nothing else to do. There was no sense in just sticking around in this godforsaken Dust Bowl village. And so they went to Afghanistan to fight the Americans, not really having any idea what they were doing, why they were fighting. They had never met an American. Like I said, they had no ideological problems with Americans. Now, that was the fighter level. The leadership level, Abu Zubaydah, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, Ramzi bin Ashib, Ayman al-Zawahiri, those guys were all different, of course. They were ideological. But at the lower level, they just didn't have anything better to do.
Yeah, now it's very interesting. Now, Carter, feel free to riff wherever you want to on this, because if you don't have anything, I got a free speech question that relates to this, which is, yeah, but go ahead.
I just want to say I'm glad you asked John that question, because I think often what happens when we too narrowly define an Overton window is we get, a lot of times a lot of us have kooky beliefs. Look, I'm an atheist. I think Christianity is a kooky belief, right? But that doesn't mean that I can dismiss everything else that Christians say. And I'm sure a lot of Christians think that I have a kooky belief, being an atheist. And when we narrowly define that Overton window and say these are the things we're allowed to talk about, and we can't communicate with people who have outrageous beliefs in some other area, I think you're right that we miss out on perspectives that, yeah, maybe sometimes they're delusional and wrong, but sometimes there's a grain of truth to why they think what they think. They're reacting to something. Maybe they're reacting in an irrational way, but there's something real underneath there that's an issue that they have that needs to be addressed. And we don't understand it if we don't talk to them. So I'm glad you asked John that question. And I think it makes a lot of sense that you find people on the outskirts like Louis Farrakhan and David Duke with some interesting things to say, as long as it's not in the wheelhouse of what they're known for.
Lee, let me add one other thing too, if I might.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
This was actually one of the lessons that I learned in prison, is that you can actually find common ground with just about everybody on something. There's going to be something that you can agree with people about or collaborate with people on. And I outline this in my second book, where on my very first day in prison, I was approached by the Aryans, for example, and a couple of days later by the Nation of Islam, and then a couple of days after that by the Mexican Mafia, and then the Italian Mafia. And, I ended up not having a problem with anybody because I sought out that common ground, and it worked for me.
Yeah. Go on. Anything on that, Carter?
I don't want to step on you. You were about to say something that was probably fascinating, Lee, so go.
I'm skeptical, but nice of you to say, though. What I was going to say is that, it seems to me some of the bias against free speech from people is the idea that if you, like, talk to John, if you talk to someone from Nation of Islam or terrorists or David Duke or whoever, that their Svengali-like powers of persuasion will be such that you will be inexorably drawn in. And that didn't happen either, right? You identifying and talking to people, you didn't become those people, did you?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. In fact, one of the Italians said to me one day, let me ask you a question. And this was an Italian to be taken seriously. He was a senior captain in the Bonanno crime family. And he said, let me ask you a question. Why do you sit with those Nazi retards in the cafeteria? And I said, geez, I don't know. My first day here, they told me to sit with them. And very dramatically, he puts his finger up in the air and he says, from today, you're with the Italians. And so I sat with the Italians after that and enjoyed myself. It's funny too, we're talking about how you can learn something from just about everybody, or you can find common ground. Other people believe that too. And so, here was the CIA guy, which to many of them was the same as being an FBI guy, which is, a death penalty offense in prison because you're a cop. And when I said, look, I'm not a cop, I was doing counterterrorism overseas to keep your family safe. And they were like, oh, okay, that was good enough for them. And then we were good. We were all good.
Well, it reminded me, I'll just tell the story briefly, Carter, because it riffs off what John was saying. So he was talking about when he was in prison. Let me tell the story about when I was in jail. When I was in jail in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, after the Alton Sterling shooting down there, a bunch of people got arrested, and among them 5 reporters, including me. And I was in a cell, and it was me, one other white guy, and everyone else was black in the cell, about 23 black guys in the cell. And I had such good conversations because, for instance, I didn't hide who I was. They were like, why are you here? I'm like, I'm a reporter for Breitbart News, which I was at the time. And I remember very specifically, we were sitting down. I was talking to this one guy, a young guy. He was, mid-20s. And he kind of leans over. He goes, you're Republican? And I said, yeah. I said, yeah. He said, I've never actually talked to a Republican. Let me ask you something. And he looked at me and said, what do you think of Trump? And he meant it, right? You see what I'm saying? It was so fascinating because you laughed a little there because you might have thought it was going to lead to trouble, right? But really, he realized it, and I was talking to them about what it was like to be poor and black in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where you got a black mayor, Kip, who's a Democrat, who'd never go into the hood. And it was really interesting, and I wrote a good piece about it at Breitbart afterwards. But that night I spent in jail, and I'll tell you who was also in the cell with me is DeRay McKesson. You know DeRay. And DeRay was a well-known Black Lives Matter guy, and he didn't talk to anybody. He was sitting there with his vest over his head on the floor, not talking. And I was in the cell with him, so I saw it. Then the next day, he wrote a piece like he was Martin Luther King in a Birmingham jail. He said, we talked about the inequities. You weren't talking to anybody. He was not talking. I watched him. He was asleep under his vest. That's what he was doing, period. But then the next day, and you know what? It's a guy like that I don't have any respect for at all. Does that make sense? Because he's phony, right? He had to say the things people want him to say. And this free speech fear thing leads right into cancel culture as well, Carter. So go ahead. Your thoughts?
Well, I'm glad you brought it back to the free speech thing. John said something that I'm paraphrasing, but you said people are kind of afraid that if you associate with this person or you talk to them, you'll somehow succumb to their mystical wiles, and like the bad ideology will seep into you unbeknownst to you, and you'll be infected. And I think that perspective is common among people who don't know why they believe what they believe and aren't thinkers, because the more you have a society full of people who don't think independently, the more that's actually true. They largely are reacting to propaganda, and they're unable to discern truth from falsehood or draw conclusions on their own. And so this idea that the free speech is this marketplace of ideas is what people call it. And the idea is that the best ideas will rise to the top. Well, just like a marketplace in capitalism, in products, the best products doesn't rise to the top. The most popular one does. And that is the best one if people are good at making decisions. But if people are not thinking and good at making decisions, then the one that's most popular is the one that prevails. And so I think, if you want to have a society, I'm all about society of free speech. I'm not saying we shouldn't have free speech, but in order to prevent a society where we have free speech from falling apart, we need to have, that needs to be coupled with the responsibility of independent thought and judgment. And when it's not, as silly as it sounds, maybe those bad ideas do actually seep into unthinking vessels.
Now, that's interesting, because that takes us into something I wanted to talk to you about. We started the show talking about some of the updates going on with COVID-19. As a person who's a rational thinker, I think it's fair to say, Carter, about you.
I hope so.
You certainly can, right? And you consider yourself a rational thinker, and rationality is important to you, is it not? That's fair, correct?
Yeah, it's the most important.
Now, when you look at the way people talk about the COVID thing, do you ever find yourself, and again, I'm not trying to make a false equivalence here, but I see a lot of bad thinking on both sides. And even the fact that there are sides, you know what there's not sides about? Like measles or whatever. Maybe there is. Right. I don't know. But well, do you see the consequences of bad thinking all around you right now on this COVID thing, Carter Laren?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, my wife and I just had a discussion about this because, the issue with the vaccinations and frankly the mandates, the lockdowns, everything, the mask mandates, all of it, is there has never been. Well, it's never been permissible in polite society, certainly not in mainstream media, to have nuanced discussions about any of this. I mean, as you know, I and Carrie, we've been arguing, for example, that masking children for whom the virus is basically not very threatening. I mean, if you look up at the rates of death for 10, 12, 13-year-old kids, it's way down the list, next to diseases you've never heard of, right? So it's not a threat to them. But having kids mask up constantly and sit at their lunch tables with masks and only move their masks to eat a bite and then put the mask back on and behave in this kind of neurotic, compulsive way with respect to each other is definitely. There's definitely a bad psychological impact. There's something negative there. And we weren't even allowed to talk about it, right? We weren't even allowed really to have the discussion in mainstream or polite society of, hey, this is a downside. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, right? I mean, obviously, if it was the zombie apocalypse and, this was the most deadly and contagious thing ever, maybe you would take that downside. But the fact that you can't talk about the downside, you couldn't talk about the downside of closing businesses, which has absolutely devastated the economy and there's been a massive transfer of wealth. You couldn't talk about the origin of the virus, potentially. You couldn't talk about the psychological ramifications on children. And you can't talk about any of the potential side effects for a vaccine that has been rushed through and in many cases, depending on the vaccine and the age group, is still only temporarily approved. And so for me, a lot of the hesitancy is simply around the way that this is being treated, right? When I go to get a measles vaccine, for example, they're very upfront with the risks and what the downsides might be. I mean, I'm the kind of person I'm not anti-science. I've been in vaccine trials. I was in a vaccine trial for Lyme disease vaccine, which had risks. But you know what? I hiked a lot. I was getting ticks on me a lot. And I thought, you know what? Screw it. The risk is worth it. I'd like to see a Lyme disease vaccine come to fruition. I'm going to participate in this. But when you're in an environment in which you are prohibited from having any nuanced discussion, you end up with one side that is only looks at the pros, and the other side, which is the ostracized, on the ostracized outskirts of society, kind of the weirdos and conspiracy theorists. They get lumped in with those weirdos and conspiracy theorists who talk about the downsides, but they don't really want to admit any upsides of vaccines or anything else because they feel like they've been put in this position of being outsiders, and they can't. They're not allowed to talk. The downsides aren't allowed to be discussed. The nuance isn't there, so they feel like they need to shine a light on the negative aspects of this. And so, we are definitely in a massively irrational relationship with both the virus and the measures we're taking to combat the virus. Very, very few people have any kind of nuanced approach to this and say, well, it is a real thing, but there's some downsides. Maybe this is how we should look at it. Maybe people should have some freedom to do X, Y, and Z. This is very few people are doing that. They're either saying the vaccine sterilizes you and it's horrible and doesn't work, or they're saying the vaccine's the best thing since sliced bread and there's never any downsides and stop complaining about your kids wearing masks. And those are just both stupid positions.
Yeah, I have to agree.
Go ahead, John. But this is exactly why I wanted to ask Carter about it.
Yeah, I think Carter's right. We've taken this disinformation, misinformation thing way too far. We've relied on private companies like Facebook, Meta, and Google to decide what's true and what's not true, who's going to be punished and not punished, who's going to be allowed to speak and who's not going to be allowed to speak, and we've blown it.
Well, and
take any healthy product. Sorry, Liev. I'm just imagine a healthy. What's something that you guys consider healthy? I mean, I like carnivore diet, so I consider steak, but maybe other people will say Brussels sprouts or broccoli or spinach, right? If there was a propaganda campaign that was every day in your face and in your kid's face saying there are no downsides to spinach, there's never anything bad about spinach, spinach is the best thing ever. If you say anything or tweet anything negative about spinach, you will be banned. I would suddenly become really, really skeptical of spinach, and I don't think that's irrational.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, and there's let's take the mask thing, because you brought that up as an example. On one hand, what I don't see the similar level of divisiveness on is Kleenex. The idea that, for instance, Kleenex, when you want to sneeze, you use it rather than, let's say, your hand or even your sleeve, right? Mask,
hopefully,
obviously, if they're stopping you from, when I've been on the bus where I'm required to wear a mask and I've sneezed. Now, I didn't have Kleenex, but I had a mask on. It's kind of gross, but it's true. And on the other hand, I understand that if I didn't have a mask on and nobody else had a mask on, that people sneezing on the bus, is kind of icky. On the other hand, masks are not some magic talisman that protect you. And I've seen people, and by the way, I'll say one other thing. I've seen people on social media go, I saw somebody wearing a mask outside, walking down the street. You know what? I'm going to tell people, I've been that guy sometimes. You know why? I forgot. I got off the bus, and I'd walked 3 blocks or half a mile or whatever, And suddenly I'm like, oh, I forgot to take off my mask. And I've seen people so angry about it. Stop caring. I don't care that much what other people do. Does that make sense, Carter?
It does, although I would say, I mean, I don't think it makes sense to be angry about it. I do think it makes sense to point it out, that say, hey, look, because you know, Lee, I think it's relevant to point it out. Hey, man, look how habituated you are to this. Like, you would agree it makes no sense to be wearing this outside by yourself, and yet here you're doing it because you're so habituated. Maybe pay attention and be conscious of the fact that this is what's going on. I mean, there was I think it was the AP that has the year in pictures or whatever it is. And I was looking at it for this year, and there's one image, and I forget where it was. It was an aid worker delivering vaccines somewhere, but he was literally alone on a mountaintop with no one around in full regalia with his mask and everything else. And I thought, yeah, that is the image of 2021. It's this normalization of protective covering that doesn't actually make sense in all circumstances. And I wouldn't criticize you for doing that. I would just point out you probably are doing it unconsciously, right?
Yeah, I'd forgotten, you know, because that happens. And by the way, it was no big deal. I took it off. It was just like, okay, no big deal. But I have seen people on social media, they get fuming. It's the equivalent of road rage, except it's mask rage. And it's a little bit weird to me. John?
You know, I went out with my sister today and her kids. We went to an antique mall in Massachusetts, and we were the only people wearing masks. Nobody else was wearing masks, which was cool. It's a choice here. You don't have to do it if you don't want to do it. But I got so hot in that mask, I felt like I was going to pass out after a while. And, you know, when you're all alone in an aisle in some store somewhere, there's no reason to have the mask on. None. You're not around anybody. You're not breathing in anybody else's air. So, yeah, I'm with you. I take mine off all the time.
Yeah, and I think there's, you know, I think maybe jumping on people and getting rabid on social media about it is probably not the answer, but I think it is worth reminding people, hey, man, when you're driving alone in the car, you don't actually need that thing.
Exactly.
Right? Like, you can take it off and try and live a conscious life and remember that there's a purpose behind, if you believe in, you know, whatever, there's a purpose behind why you're wearing that. And it's important to be conscious of it. But, you know, one of the things that's happened, you know, Lee, to circle back to what you were saying and how people are being irrational about this. I mean, one of the things that I really miss is this recognition that, hey, guys, life is risk. There is no perfectly safe. There is no perfectly dangerous. Well, maybe you could probably jump out of a plane without a parachute. There's some things, right? But there's nothing perfectly safe. And part of life is cost benefit analysis, and it's a risk assessment. And so when you get into a car, you make a risk assessment about whether you're going to drive and how fast you're going to drive and where you're going to drive and what neighborhoods you'll drive through and wear your seatbelt and what kind of car you get into. And when you eat food, you do the same thing. And when you engage in casual sex, you're doing the same thing. And when you share drinks at the office, you're doing the same thing. If you drink out of someone else's cup, everything you do is a risk assessment. And
that's right.
This is being treated as if there is a way to 100% make yourself safe, and anything that deviates from that is absolute disaster. It's a Manichaean, and it's insane.
Well, it's what? You used a big word, and I'm confused.
A Manichaean, like black and white. It's like an either or. It's this bifurcation into everything's black and white, right? Instead of the reality, which is life is a nuanced game of risk management. That's what life is. And everyone has different risk tolerances. Everyone has different susceptibilities to different things. Everyone has different goals. And one of the beauties of freedom is people are allowed to make risk management decisions on their own. And that's been taken away from us.
Yeah, and that is, you know, it's interesting, too, because the other guy who talks about risk management a lot is also libertarian, is when we have Mark Frost on the show. That topic comes up. But fantastic conversation. Carter Laren, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks again to George Samueli. We'll be back tomorrow, John, on The Backstory.